let's start by defining what the purpose of a government is, because there's a lot of people, certainly in England and in other countries, that have been led to believe that the purpose of a government is to do everything for the people, to
Yeah.
provide almost everything, and practically wipe their ass when they go to the loo. And I strongly disagree with that. I think the role of a government is something we haven't defined very well for a long time.
On the I just want to quickly say on the topic of running it as a business, I agree to a large extent, but the thing is that if you had a business that large, you would want more than just one person making decisions. You would want a group of people with some stratification, with a singular leader, and you would want those people to essentially reflect the will of the broader organism. And you would want free market forces guiding it in the correct direction. All of those things exist in democracy in one form or another. The issue with democracy, the reason it differs from free market forces, is because at best you have a duopoly, which is not great in a free market. And often you end up with a monopoly when the parties decide that they have more in common with each other than they do with the people they're supposed to represent. And when you get a monopoly in politics, it's the same as when you get a monopoly in the free market. It goes to shit. And when they control everything, then the whole everything goes to shit as a result. So it's much worse. But I do think it is actually very similar to a private enterprise.
I mean, yes. I mean, a private enterprise, I've often argued that government should be run in a very similar manner to a private enterprise. One of the reasons why, when back in 2015, 2016, Donald Trump stood up, I before he started memeing and being a massive shitlord, and only Rosie O'Donnell, etc., and being the general funny fucker that he is. The concept of finally someone that actually knows how to run a business is going to get into government, because politicians, by and large, most of them are fairly in terms of the economy. They've maybe studied economics, but they've never run a company, or certainly not a large company. They've usually been career politicians, which means that they're sucked up to people that run businesses, not actually run them. And most people that run businesses aren't suck-ups.
I don't think it always has to be the case that a politician is useless or an idiot. When you have a monopoly, i.e. when you don't have enough outside forces pressuring towards merit, then the people in it don't have to be as meritorious, so they end up being worse. And once some people start doing that, they all start doing it. And with a government, unlike with a private business, because the government can control the market so much more than a private business can, they can control the market to make it more amiable to their kind of person. So they can actually make it worse and worse and worse over time, which is, of course, a danger. But as part of what Pax is saying, a government is inevitable. I think perhaps that's a way to start this is and to aid what you're saying about defining a government, is that there will, my expression that I bring up every time we discuss ways to run a society, there will always be a warlord. Always, always, always. Sometimes you'll get five minutes where there hasn't been one yet, but within, say, the span of a week, there will always, always, always be a warlord, no matter what you do. Anarchist society, a warlord very quickly, who will be very brutal, of course. And with a fascist society, your warlord is well recognized as such. In a democracy, the objective, therefore, for a civilized society is to make your warlord as reasonable as possible. And that's the idea of democracy.
I mean, in a good, well-functioning, peaceful democracy, your warlords tend not to be, charging around with actual armies. They tend to be, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, etc. They're people running very large companies, and they do their warfare in terms of, at the boardroom and corporatism and products.
Yeah, it's very abstracted. You see, this is part of the problem as well, is what you've just mentioned. Those people, they're not government, but because they're so powerful, they are essentially the primary warlords, and they in part own and run government. which is part of the problem.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not exactly a new phenomenon, but it's perhaps newly this bad because of globalization. Corporations
Yes.
can now be more powerful than nations, or much more easily, and so governments aren't really in charge anymore. And that is because the people who run those governments aren't forcing the issue, but because things are getting worse, people seem to be now forcing the issue. Is why you get movements of new politics, which is an argument I would certainly make for the effectiveness of democracy when times are not great. It's very good at pulling out of a nosedive, whereas other systems which perhaps are very good in the short term aren't anywhere near as good at pulling out a nosedive. If you have a single leader, if you have a single way, a rigid structure of governance, and it starts not working anymore, well, they've got a lot more to change with the person who literally set it up in the first place and his cronies, the ones who are supposed to change it. And it's very, very unlikely they'll be able to do that if the system is structured in such a way to endorse one ideology, and that ideology is not working anymore. The system is likely to collapse. In democracy, the structure is very neutral.
Yes, and we've seen this time and time again in the 20th century. One European government that often slips people's mind is Franco Spain, which was a fully functioning and very successful actual fascist government. We're not talking about current fascist, which God knows what most people mean when they say it. But it was an actual fascist government that operated from, the 1930s up until the mid-1970s when Franco died. But when it died, he wanted it to go and revert back to being a democracy, and he guided it in that way. He knew, essentially, that what he was doing was protecting his country from communism, and wanted to build the system up to the point where he was happy for it to be handed back to the people. And nobody ever talks about Franco because it's embarrassing for a lot of the current leftists, because Spain operated very peacefully and very happily by and large. Yes, it was under an iron fist, but that was a fully functioning, operating fascist government that went for absolutely years.
I think the one time that a iron fist kind of rulership is acceptable is when things get so bad that you're in fight or flight, emergency circumstances. You need to do that radical recorrection, that the long-term benefit, the stability, the adaptability of democracy is not worth the fact that in the short term, it's not quite as good as you can do with an iron-fisted, collectivist, top-down, direct ideology. But as you said, it should then be returned. There's many stories from the ancient Roman Republic / Empire of emperors who took up power and then were either politely requested to give it up, or who gave it up completely voluntarily. I can't remember his name, but there was that the guy the farmer who was asked to be the emperor for a while, settle things down, and then voluntarily return to farming. That's an ideal. It's very ambitious to think that could happen reliably, but if necessary, I think that is acceptable for a system which isn't working in its current state. But in most cases, it hasn't failed as a result of democracy. It's failed as a result of a lack of vigilance and problems stacking up too quickly. But with sufficient vigilance and understanding, and with a course correction, democracy is still the most adaptable system.